The purpose of this video is to explain the hardware requirements for ME30 for Fall 2020. You should be watching this in the first week or two of the semester because there are some actions that you're going to need to take to be prepared for the coursework that's coming in a couple of weeks. For pretty much all of the last decade, there's been a hardware component to ME30 because this course is a prereq for ME106, which is Introduction to Mechatronics, which at least 95% of you watching this have as a department requirement for graduation. ME106 primarily involves hardware, both electronics and mechanical, and this course gradually has you start preparing for that. Using hardware also has a benefit that, for most of you, it's likely going to be more interesting than just reading a bunch of typed-in data from a keyboard or a file and then barfing it back out in some other form onto a screen. Pretty much year after year, almost all students in the final survey say that the most interesting part of this course is working with the hardware. We hope that this semester will continue that tradition. The entire course is taught using Python, but it starts off using Python exclusively on the PC. Now, we tend to use the term PC to mean whatever laptop or desktop you're using, regardless of whether it's Linux or Mac OS or Windows. So PC is always shorthand for whatever type of machine you're doing your writing of your programs and the rest of your coursework on. You're required to have a PC pretty much as a student in the engineering college, so hardware requirements for having a PC available to you aren't new to this course. So after you learn the basics of the Python language during the first few weeks, you'll transition into using the hardware for parts of a number of the labs and the homeworks throughout most of the rest of the course. Not everything in the course can be done on the hardware board because it's simply not a powerful enough platform to use for even medium-sized amounts of data or code. Some weeks of the course may mostly be programming on the PC, whereas other weeks may mostly be on the hardware. As an ME, we anticipate that many of you will be doing programming on the PC and on hardware during the remainder of your classes in the department and later on in your career. And that's why we're getting you started using both like this right now. The way that hardware selection has always worked until this semester was that you'd be buying a single kit to use for both ME30 and ME106. The kit would combine an off-the-shelf microcontroller board. In past semesters, that was an Arduino board, but that changed as of last year or so. And some one or more other accessory boards that were designed to plug in that were made for both ME30 and ME106 specifically. Historically, we always believed that it made more sense for you to just get one set of hardware for ME30 for both courses, and that most students would incorporate much of the kit that they bought into ultimately their ME106 term project. The main reasoning was that since almost all projects tend to use, at the minimum, a core set of components like buttons and LEDs and potentiometers and various other sensors, that by integrating all these together into one kit, projects would be easier and faster to build up and they'd be more robust than they would otherwise. And it was always the case that having everything pre-assembled and nearly bulletproof was always pretty much of a must for ME30 because we didn't want hardware issues to be a reliability concern. And what is supposed to be a course where you entirely focus on acquiring just basic software skills. So for ME30, there's no wiring or electronics knowledge required for you to use this hardware, and that's totally by design. In fact, ME30 has virtually no prerequisites, if any. So there's no requisite knowledge of electronics or mechanical components or anything like that. And since we only have 2 units worth of time budget to play with in this course, we totally avoid talking about electronics at any significant level at all until ME106, where that type of material belongs. However, big however, over the years, we've seen students underutilize their full kits for building their projects in ME106. We think that there's multiple reasons why it's been this way, And unfortunately, none of the root causes for this are easily solvable within the constraints of that class either, unfortunately. So because only about 15% or so of students by observation tend to use, the majority of their kit for the purposes that we designed it for, we've decided this semester, beginning this academic year, we're going to try a different approach. So the end result is that we're taking a totally different approach to hardware selection for both ME30 and ME106. And we're uncoupling them, the requirements for the hardware platforms to be the same, for a year to see how this setup works for everybody. From a cost to students standpoint, going with two different but maybe less flexible hardware platforms actually ends up being a bit less expensive than the old setup that we've pretty much used for, like I said, about a decade. And the reason for this is it's a very common engineering trade-off where if you want flexibility, you generally have to pay for it. So this comes at some increased cost. But if the benefits aren't realized by that extra cost, then basically you've over-engineered a solution and you haven't done it right. So we're being pragmatic and we're thinking this might possibly be the case. So we're going to take a different tack. So we have reason to believe that this new approach will end up serving both courses, ME30 and ME106, even better, perhaps, than having one set of hardware for both courses did previously. And secondarily, the price of admission for ME30 is now significantly less than it was when you were paying upfront for the hardware for both ME30 and ME106. Which you may not even have taken for another year or two in some cases. So given the near-term economic and remote learning circumstances in fall 2020, we think that that's another significant benefit to this new arrangement. So this semester, we are switching to a board called the Circuit Playground Express, which is shown here on the screen. And it tends to get abbreviated on the company who makes it their website as the CPX. So in a lot of our documentation, we're going to carry that abbreviation forward and pretty much refer to it as the CPX also. So it's made by the same company that made the board that we're still using in ME106 and the core board that's used in the previous kit that I've already mentioned. So both platforms, both the one we used to use and are currently using for ME106 plus this one, both use the same version of Python called CircuitPython, and the processors are fairly similar between the chip used in ME106 and this one. They're virtually identical, at least as far as you're concerned in that respect, for the most part. How they work is similar enough that you'll definitely be a step ahead over transfer students, for example, but that by the time you get to 106, that this will be a benefit for using this particular board. You'll already be a significant step along the way of familiarity when you get to that course by using this platform. So the CPX, the CircuitPython Express, or Circuit Playground Express, was designed by Adafruit to be an on-ramp for using Python to program hardware. The hardware works with a few other programming languages that are targeted to students as young as like junior high school, but none of those languages are we particularly interested in at the college level, at least in STEM programs. If anyone else has heard of or even used the Arduino, both this board and the ME106 board can be programmed using the Arduino system, which if you want to learn about that in the future, you can do that with this hardware. And that language is basically based on the C++ language. However, we're using Python now in this department because it's considerably more likely that MEs like you are going to be running into Python later in life than you will necessarily be using C++. Now, if you happen to be a recurring player from ME30 last semester, rest assured that the main board in the kit that you bought in that kit is still the same one that we're using in ME106 for the foreseeable future. So nothing's changed in that respect. The kit that you bought comes with all the promises that we made to you last semester, and that this is hardware that you're going to get use of for the cost you invested in it last semester. However, I guess the bad news is that you will have to get a CPX for this semester. And although some components in the kit that you bought are the same as those that are on this board, about half are not. And so trying to come up with labs and homeworks that work on both platforms would ultimately probably end up being the worst outcome for everyone, whether you had a kit from last semester or are using the current proposed hardware. So we're definitely not going in that direction. I mean, we'd only get to use the components that overlapped this board and the previous kit, and that would be a fairly small set of the most mundane components, and that would be kind of boring. Limit ourselves to that, no matter which hardware you have. So even though it's possible that some simpler ME106 final projects could be built around the board that we're using for ME30, the Circuit Playground Express, in general, it's not the platform that I'd ever choose to be the main platform for ME106. I feel that it's generally a poor fit for the lab portion of that course, partially due to its slower processor, but mostly just because of the way it's physically designed. I don't really want to go into the details or the reasons for that here, but they'll become pretty clear to you once you get into ME106. And even anticipating that many ME106 project teams won't end up using their ME30 hardware because of its design, the total out-of-pocket costs are still less for separate hardware for this course and that course compared to the complete kit hardware approach that we used until recently. So, however, some students may use their ME30 hardware perhaps as a side component for an ME106 project or for other courses potentially within this department. They can also give or resell their CPX to another ME30 student next semester or subsequently, or they can give it to friends or family that are interested in starting to learn about programming using hardware. I anticipate that any or all of those are going to be an option for most of you. That said, I don't really anticipate that most of you are going to, you might lend your board to somebody else if you don't happen to be using it next semester in ME106, but I anticipate that almost everybody's pretty much going to want to hang on to their hardware because it's going to be fun to use. So all that being said, all those caveats about how it's not that useful for ME106, I do feel that this hardware is almost ideal for ME30. So for what we're going to be using it for in ME30, it's very cost effective. It has a great form factor, and it's a pretty compelling platform for getting started learning Python and talking to hardware. It comes with a selection of built-in components that make it very useful and interesting. And by having everything together on one fairly small, complete board, it's easy and simple to handle, which is important for this course. And there's enough features on this board that it would still be a good choice even if this course were 3 or 4 units in an introductory programming course. So there's a lot here.